Hey all, I hope everyone is going well and getting lots of sewing done. I can't believe that we're up to the September sew-along already. It's been a wonderful year of sew-alongs with so many beautiful designs and the introduction of the new KISS sew-along. One of my favourite aspects about Sweepy is when the amazing community comes together and tries their hand at making these beautiful designs. The project for the September sew-along will be the fantastic indoor plants table runner. The design comes with 5 different blocks and can be made in the 5x7, 6x10 and the 7x12 hoops. In this video tutorial, I will show you the stitch out of the Swiss cheese plant block and the construction of the table runner. We also recommend that you follow our photograph written instructions while completing your table runner. Before we get started, remember to like and subscribe. Begin by hooping up cutaway stabilizer in the hoop and load the design onto your machine. Then place batting 1 on top of the hoop and stitch down. Once stitched down, remove the hoop from your machine and trim the batting about 1 to 2 millimeters from the stitching, using your applique scissors. Stitch the placement line for the background. Next, place fabric A right side up on top of the hoop, covering the placement line and stitch down. Remove the hoop from your machine and trim the fabric about 1 to 2 millimeters from the stitching. Leave the excess fabric in the seams. Embroider the quilting on fabric A. Embroider the 3 back stems. Now stitch the placement line for the top left leaf. Place 1 piece of fabric B on top of the placement line and stitch down. Trim fabric B, leave the excess fabric in the seams. Embroider the quilting detail and middle stem on the fabric B leaf. Embroider the satin stitch around the fabric B leaf. Embroider the main stem connecting the fabric B leaf. Using the bottom stitching line of fabric A as a placement line, place fabric C wrong side up, crossing the placement line 1/4 inch and the excess pointing towards the top of the hoop. Stitch down. Fold over and stitch down. Don't trim any fabric. Repeat the applique process with the fabric C leaf. Trim, leaving the excess fabric in the seams. Embroider the quilting detail on the fabric C leaf, and then the satin stitch around that same leaf. Embroider the middle stem on the fabric C leaf. Repeat the applique process with the fabric D leaf. Trim, leaving the excess fabric in the seams. Embroider the quilting detail on the fabric D leaf and then the satin stitch around the same leaf. Embroider the middle stem on the fabric D leaf. Repeat the applique process with the fabric E leaf. Trim, leaving the excess fabric in the seams. Embroider the quilting detail on the fabric E leaf and then satin stitch around the same leaf. Embroider the middle stem on the fabric E leaf. You have now completed the stitch out of the Swiss cheese plant block. Remove your work from the hoop and trim the seams to about 1/2 inch using a rotary cutter and ruler. Here you have the completed block. Hold aside and follow the instructions for the remaining blocks you want to make. Fantastic work, everyone. I will now show you how to construct the indoor plant table runner. Lay out your runner in order with the long side of the panels together. Place the first 2 panels right sides together and pin along one edge up the border stitching the best you can. Take your time with this process. Take the pinned panels over to your sewing machine and sew a 1/2 inch seam, sewing just inside the border lines already on the panels. Open the seams and iron them flat. Continue joining the other panels in the same fashion. Attaching the flat piping and borders. To make the flat piping, first measure the length of the joined blocks. Allow for 1 inch overlapping each end. Cut 2 strips of your piping fabric I at this length. Note, the flat piping strips should not have any joins in them, as this will cause them to look uneven when finished. Press the strips of the flat fabric for the binding in half widthways, ensuring the raw edges are sitting exactly on top of each other. Lay a flat piping strip on top of one of the long side edges of the right side of the joined blocks, with the folded edge pointing towards the center of the background fabric. Pin or quilt clip together and stitch into place with a 1/4 inch seam. Repeat for the opposite long side edge of your runner. The edges of the flat piping will overlap the ends. Trim the excess fabric so the piping is in line with the ends of the runner. Measure the width of the blocks, allowing for an inch overlap in the side edges. Cut 2 strips of your piping fabric J this length. Repeat the pinning and stitching process for the 2 short ends using fabric J. To add the backing, use a measuring tape and measure the length and width of your runner. Place your backing fabric K, wrong side up on top of your work surface. Then place the runner you have just made right side up on top of the backing fabric, wrong sides together. This step is optional. You can lightly spray your backing down to your runner to help the border stay in place while attaching the binding. Alternatively, you can base stitch the backing to the borders after completing your stitch in the ditch. To join the backing, stitch in the ditch the seams in between each block, as well as the 2 end seams. If you have added the flat piping like we have, simply lift it up out of the way so you don't sew over the top of it. Once this is done, trim the excess backing so it matches the exact shape of the runner. To prepare the binding, use your own preferred way of adding the binding to the outer edges of your runner, or follow our method of making a binding. To make the binding, measure the length and width of the runner and then add them together and then multiply by 2. If you are cutting 1 strip of fabric for the binding, add about an extra 12 to 16 inches, 30 to 40 centimeters to the new measurement. The length and width added together and then multiply by 2. That's to be sure you have enough fabric in the end. Or alternatively, cut a few strips and then join them together with your sewing machine as shown. Add extra length if you're joining strips. About 4 inches, 10 centimeters per strip. The width is optional, but we usually find 3 inches, 8 centimeters wide sufficient. Lay the ends of your fabric strips right sides together at a right angle. Draw a 45-degree angle with a fabric marker. Pin the 2 pieces of fabric together, keeping the edges matching. Then sew a diagonal seam from corner to corner. Cut the corner a 1/4 inch from the stitch down line. Now iron open the seam, and repeat until all the binding strips are sewn together into one long strip. Then fold the whole strip in half, wrong sides together, and iron down. Lay out your binding fabric and unfold one end. Fold that open end of the binding to a 45-degree angle as shown below and lightly press. Trim your fabric a 1/4 inch from the 45-degree angle fold. Fold the binding strip in half again as shown. You can work from either the front of the runner or the back of the runner. We have decided to stitch our binding to the back of the runner, first to make it easier to hide the border stitching on the front of the runner. Match the raw edges of the quilt and the binding to the desired starting location. Start about halfway along one side. Using a ruler, mark 1 inch down from the end of the strip. Mark with a pin. Using a ruler, mark 3 inches down from the 1 inch mark. Mark with a second pin. At this time, we also marked a 2 inch gap above from the first pin. This pin will signal when to stop stitching once we have sewn around the wall hanging. Using a 3/8 of an inch seam, stitch 1 inch of the open fold onto the wall hanging and stop stitching once you get to the 1 inch mark. Then leave a 3 inch gap. This will provide an opening to insert the end of the binding fabric when we have completed the sewing. Then start stitching again at the 3 inch mark. Continue sewing until you reach the first corner and stop stitching 3/8 of an inch or 1 centimeter from the end. Keep your needle down. Lift your foot and turn your quilt with your needle still down. Continue stitching to the corner. Lift the binding strip over and pull against the angled stitch that we have just made to form a diagonal fold. Then fold the binding strip back down, creating a fold at the top. Pin and start stitching again, until you reach around the side of the quilt you started on, mitering the corners as you go. Stop stitching when you get to the pin that marks the 2 inches from the starting point. Fold up the remaining binding so it sits just above the first 3 inch mark. Trim the excess binding, leaving enough to slip into the fold. Trim a 1/8 of an inch or 2 to 3 millimeters off the raw edge of the binding for a good 1 inch, 2 to 3 centimeters. Place the end of the binding fabric into the pocket created at the start of the binding process. Pin in place. Continue to stitch the seam until the binding is completely sewn on. Fold back the binding and iron the seams flat. Now turn the runner over so you're working on the front of the runner. We started at the corners of the runner. Fold in one side of the corner just past the stitching and iron well. Pin in place. This will help get a nice pointed corner. Repeat for the other side of the corner, meeting up with the first fold, creating a nice pointed corner. Pin in place. Repeat for all 4 corners of the runner. Then continue folding and pinning the remaining binding to the front of the runner, just past the stitching. Once folded, iron well. Start stitching anywhere on the runner from the front. Make sure your top thread and bobbin thread match the colour of your binding and backing fabrics. When you get to the corner, simply just leave your needle down and lift the foot and rotate the runner. Put your foot down and continue stitching in this fashion until you're right around the runner. Once you have completed that, give it a good press with the iron and enjoy your runner. Well, there we have it, folks. Another sew along in the books. Thank you for watching this video tutorial on the amazing indoor plant table runner from Sweet Pea Machine Embroidery. Remember to share your wonderful projects on the Sew Along Facebook group, and let's share the love. If you enjoyed this video tutorial, remember to like and subscribe. I'll see you again for next month's Sew Along. Happy crafting!